Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the Entra Bicep Extensibility. Now I've done videos on Bicep before, so I'm not going to go into all of the details about Bicep, but at a very high level I can think of Bicep as this ability to create these declarative infrastructure as code files where I state what I want to exist in Azure. I don't have to tell it how to do it. I want a storage account with this configuration. And the beauty is, so I create these Bicep files. And once again, it's declarative. I'm just telling it what I want to exist within the cloud. I don't have to tell it how to do it at all. So I have this declarative Bicep file, and what actually happens behind the scenes is this .bicep file gets transpiled into the .native JSON template file, which then, hey, I can go and talk via the Azure Resource Manager endpoint and go and create those things in Azure. So that's how we use these Bicep files. And because I'm just telling it what I want that end desired state to be, I never have to worry about what is currently there. If what I state in the file exists in that state, nothing happens. If it's missing, it will create it. If it doesn't match the configuration, well, it will go and change that configuration. So another great feature we get as part of these is they are idempotent. I can run it and run it and run it. I can run it as many times as I want. It won't do any damage. It's constantly looking, hey, this is what I'm telling it my desired end state to be. Does it match what actually goes and exists up there? And if it does, fantastic, I don't have to do anything. And there's a lot of great integration with Bicep, for example, from VS Code. I get IntelliSense. And because of the great investment in Bicep, because it's so human readable, that's the whole point of it. It is this domain specific language that instead of me as a human being trying to grapple with what is not super friendly with JSON, we like Bicep. And if I'm an Azure first organization, and obviously I want to be using declarative technologies, I want to be using infrastructure as code, I can then build it into my pipelines, you're probably using Bicep. Now, if I'm a multi-cloud organization, I might be using something like Terraform instead. But I'm using Bicep, I'm creating all my Azure resources. But there's a but. There's a lot of feedback that, great, from my Bicep file, I can go and integrate very nicely with Azure. But there's something else that very commonly ties in with Azure. And that is Entra. So I have my Entra tenant. And if I think about the types of resource I may create in Azure, maybe, for example, I'm creating a managed identity, a user assigned managed identity, and I want it to have certain roles. Well, ideally, we would just add that to a group. So I'm creating some resource, and really I'd like to be manipulating a group. And maybe I can't use a managed identity. Maybe I'm using some kind of service principal. Maybe I'm using some kind of federated identity. And today there's a gap because the way Bicep works is it's going through the deployment engine. It gets transpiled to JSON. It goes to ARM. ARM has very limited ability to then go and do things to Entra. So what I end up having to do is some fairly ugly stuff. I might use a deployment script. And so from a deployment script, I can then go and run stuff. But now it's imperative. I'm telling it, run this command. And so if maybe it's been run in the past and it tries to run it again, well, Entra won't like that. I'll get failures. So that doesn't work super well. What has happened, though, is Bicep now has an extensibility framework. For example, there is some Kubernetes extensibility. Things I can do with kubectl, I can now go as part of my Bicep file using the Kubernetes extensibility and go and do things on my Kubernetes cluster. Now I have to enable this extensibility first. So Step 1, if I jump over here, is in this example, in the folder I'm going to have my Bicep file, I create this Bicep configuration file. So I've got bicep config.json, and I'm turning on extensibility. So that's a step 1. I have to go and enable that. Now, once I turn on this extensibility, we can now take advantage of it. And what's happening here is if I think about Entra, how do I typically integrate and talk to Entra? Well, we have the Microsoft Graph API. So that's a RESTful MPI. I can talk to it via HTTPS. So we have the Microsoft Graph. And so we have there's different versions of the API. There's kind of like a V1, there's a beta version. And Graph is phenomenal because with Microsoft Graph, hey, I can go and talk to M365. I can talk to Dynamics 365. There's a bunch of Windows services that I can go and talk to from this. There's the various enterprise mobility and security services like Intune and device states. I can talk to those. But what I can also talk to as part of that is Entra. So now I have this ability to communicate via a RESTful API to Entra and make it do various things. And so what's happened here is as part of that extensibility of Bicep, they have created a Microsoft Graph Bicep extension. And what that enables me to now do is from within my Bicep file, if I'm actually creating a graph resource, that's terrible. Let's just redraw the E. If I'm doing a graph resource, it will now go to that Bicep extension, which will now go and talk to the Microsoft Graph API, which can go and talk to Entra. So hooray! I can now, from my Bicep file, talk about Entra things as well. And once again, I'll see that in my file. So if I jump back over to my file, I've enabled that extensibility, and I tell it, hey, look, I want to use the Microsoft Graph extension. So I put that into my file. And now I'm ready to go. And that extension Microsoft Graph tells the Bicep engine that this is not going via an ARM resource provider. So I'm giving it that knowledge. Fantastic. But there is another but in a way here. Remember, the whole point of Bicep is it's declarative. All I have to do is state what is the desired end state, and then the magical engine will make what is in Azure match my file. So now we're going to use this declarative technology to talk to Microsoft Graph to go and create things in Entra. But if I think about that declarative, remember, there were really a number of attributes, but one of them was idempotency. I can run it again and again and again. Well, ordinarily, when I talk to Microsoft Graph, I run a post command. Well, that won't work. If I use post to create a resource, and then, hey, I run that Bicep file again and again and again, the second time it runs that post command, it's going to get an error. It's going to say the object already exists. So that's problem one. The other problem is, with these declarative resources, I name the resource ahead of time as the client. So it's a client-provided key. When I create the resource in Azure, I give it the name, and it goes and creates that. It is not service generated. In Entra, all of those keys are service generated. So these are both challenges. So this is not going to work. I can't have this with Entra. Now, the good news is they have solutions to both of these. So there have been enhancements to Graph for specific resources, which is why when we talk about this MS Graph Bicep extension, it's only for certain types of object today. So the first thing they introduced was this concept of, instead of post, I'm going to use UPSERT. So I can think of UPSERT as an update and insert. So behind the scenes, I'm going to do a patch operation. So instead of doing a put, I'm going to do a patch operation that will create the object if it doesn't exist, or if it does exist, then I can modify the object to make it match what I'm requesting. So what that requires is the particular object has to support this UPSERT. And we can go and look at the documentation, and we can see, for example, in groups, if I look at group, they have added UPSERT. And it talks about how if it doesn't exist, it will go and create it. If it does exist, update the properties to make it match. If I was to go and look at applications, and let's look at application, we can see they've added this UPSERT capability. If I look at service principal, we can see they've added this UPSERT capability. So this was a key requirement here. It's not just, hey, you create this Bicep extensibility to work with Entra. Because of the declarative nature of Bicep, we have to be able to have that idempotency when we go and talk to Entra. And so this required those people that manage those particular types of objects to go and add support for UPSERT. So this is the first key change that was made. We have to have that UPSERT capability. Additionally, hey, this client-provided key, that is not going to work. We have the Entra-created ID for all of the objects. We have that GUID. And so what they've added is the ability to have an alternate key. So what it now supports is this alternate key pattern. So that lets me have a secondary key that I can now specify as part of the creation, that once I set it, that again, it's idempotent, it becomes this read-only attribute. And I still have the system-generated ID. So this is an alternate key. So once again, if I go and look at the group again, and I look at the properties of group, well, sure enough, we'll still see ID. You can see we have ID, this unique identity returned over here, for example. But what we also have, if I keep scrolling down, is we have this concept of unique name. Can be assigned to a group, is used as an alternate key. It's immutable, and then becomes read-only. So that solves both of those challenges we had. We have the ability to now keep running this UPSERT operation, which will either create it or modify it based on what I want. And I can specify that value that I want, and it can still have its system-generated key that it uses internally in Entra. So all that means is the same way I would now declare ARM resources, I can define my Microsoft Graph as well. Now, as I already talked about, it is a very limited set of objects that support this today because of the work that has to be done to support this UPSERT and this alternate key pattern. It's probably going to grow over time, but it is limited to very specific ones today. If we were to go and look at what I can do today, so we'll use the intelligence to help us. If I just do resource, and if I just type graph, then I can see what it supports today. So what it's really boiling down to is applications, federated identity credentials, app role assigned to, groups, OAuth2 permission grants and service principals. And also, if I look at the documentation in the reference, it shows me those same list of resources there as well. Now, once again, I would expect probably this will grow over time, but today that is what we are looking at. So I can think about, yep, so I've got that app role. Well, so I have applications, app role assignments, and then I have the OAuth2 permissions grants. But they're typically the ones that we will use the most. Hey, I'm creating a managed identity. I want to add it to a group so it gets some role. Hey, I'm trying to integrate with GitHub Actions. I need to create the application. I need to give it some app role assignment. I'm using some federated identity. That's what I'm typically going to do. So let's take a look at this. So we go back to our little sample file. And I've already filled this. You can see I've already filled in an example of this, but we'll walk through if we were creating one from scratch, just so you can see the niceness of the IntelliSense as well. So we'll start retyping this line. So we'll do test group 2. We'll type graph, and I'll select groups. Now it's showing me the API versions. So I'm going to use the V1, not the beta. So press tab. Now I'm just going to press space. And yes, I'll do equals. I'm not going to use an existing. So I push enter, push space again. Now it's showing me what I could do. I could just do empty squiggly brackets, or it's very nicely suggesting, hey, do you want me to fill in all of the required properties for you? Yes, that sounds lovely. So let's do that. So again, push tab. And now it's showing me what all of those required properties are. So I would need a display name, a mail enabled, a mail nickname, security enabled, and that unique name. Now from there, I could obviously do other things as well. For example, members, I'll just do tab, and then I could go and create an array that contains all of the different members I would want. Now, one of the things I could absolutely do here, let's just uncomment this for a second. And we'll uncomment this. This is if I was going to create a managed identity. So what I could absolutely do as part of this in my members, I could actually just start, remember this is called managed identity. If I just started typing managed identity dot properties dot principal ID, I can just reference those other objects that I've created elsewhere in this ARM template. Now, one of the things, and just to be aware of this, if I was actually running this, and I'm not going to, realize that Entra is obviously a global database, and it can take a bit of time for it to converge. And the only reason I'm saying that is if you consider, therefore, if I went and in my Bicep file, create a managed identity, great. It will, obviously, a managed identity is a special type of service principal in Entra. So it goes and creates a new service principal. And then in the same Bicep file, I'm saying, hey, give it this app role, add it to this group. There's a chance that from a convergence perspective, when I'm trying to add that principal ID, the property of the object I'm creating, it wouldn't have converged fully yet. So I may actually get an error. Now, remember, this is now idempotent. So as long as I did a check for the error as part of my deployment of the Bicep file, I just run it again. And now Entra would have converged, and now it will go and add it to the group or give it that role. But realize you may get an error if I try and actually in the same file, hey, create the managed identity, and instantly as the same file, give it a role, give it a group membership. It might say, I can't find it yet. But it's idempotent. I just run it again, and then it would work. So I just wanted to call that out because you may see that. But if we carry on, if I look at mine, I'm being lazy. So all I'm going to actually do is, actually, that's the wrong line to comment out. I definitely need the extension. I don't need to specify a location because I'm only going to work with Entra in this file. All I'm doing in my one is, you can see, yes, I'm creating, well, I'm specifying I want a group. I want it to have this display name. It's not mail enabled. It's just security. I have a unique name, and I'm adding just the GUIDs of 2 objects, just so I'm not relying on anything else. So I'm just doing static, but it is idempotent. I can run it as often as I want. And then if I take this, make sure it's saved. If I just run this file, go in the right folder. If I look super quickly at my Entra, so this is the resource group. I'm deploying it into a resource group. There's no deployments yet. And if I look at my groups, I do not have a test group 1 anywhere. So I'm just going to do a new deployment into the resource group. And we'll let that run. It should be pretty quick. So it's telling me I'm using experimental Bicep features have been enabled. Yep, well aware of that. It's telling me it has succeeded. So that's always encouraging. And so now if I jump back over to the portal and I refresh, so there's my test group. And it should have 2 members, which is what I specified as part of my file. I should also see a deployment because it was still a deployment. There we go. And deployment is complete. Got the deployment details. We'll show here. And so it still shows as ARM doing a deployment, but obviously it's going via that extensibility to actually go and create those Entra graph resources. And there are many, many other examples. If we go and look at the Git repo, there are a bunch of quick starts, and you can go through these. For example, I mentioned that GitHub Actions one. So there's an example here where it uses a number of different Microsoft Graph resources. So it creates an application. It's got a federated identity credential sort of definition. Then it's going ahead and it wants a service principal for that. And then it's just using a Microsoft authorization. So then that's giving it some permissions to my ARM resources. There are examples of group assignments. It's probably going to be a much better one than I showed. So this is using an existing group. So notice it can do existing equals, and then the name of the group. And then it's doing a role assignment to the group. So there's things I can do there. You can basically just go through and you can see there's a whole bunch of different examples they have put together to help you understand exactly what I can do. But the ultimate end result of this now is from my deployment pipelines, for example, well, hey, I can have that GitHub pipeline that wants to call some Azure resource, and maybe I don't want to store secrets in GitHub. I could have a federated identity credential to enable the GitHub action to call the Azure CLI without having to manage any secrets, all just via using the Graph API. You could say I could add managed identities to a group. I could take a group and give it an Azure role. All of those things I'm now doing via this declarative idempotent format, all in one. Now, today, it errs on the side of safety. And what I mean by that is, for example, with groups, it will add people into a group, but it will not remove members via Bicep. Think of it like an append mode. That would be the best way. Today, that's how it functions. But if you go and look at that GitHub repo, for example, there's already a bunch of suggestions about changes to this behavior, and this will be changing. So there will be replace semantics that I'll be able to leverage to actually make it match what I define in my declarative file. Now, from a permissions perspective, is exactly what you would expect. Now, firstly, I'm running an ARM deployment. So I have to have the ability for whatever that resource group is to be able to perform deployments. But then I have to have permission to act on whatever Entra object I am acting on. Now, ordinarily with Entra, there's the user permissions and then there's the app permissions. And I can only perform via an app the union, what they both have to there. Now, in this case, with the Bicep extension, we're working through the Azure CLI or PowerShell, which is already being authorized to perform these actions against Entra. But if in the future, look at documentation, if you started to use something else, then just realize the application itself. So we can see here this example that it talks about, hey, I can perform what both the user has and what the app has been permissioned for. Now, again, the Azure CLI and the PowerShell, it has already been approved to be used for those functions. But if in the future I was doing something else, if I was doing a service principal to run in a zero-touch deployment, realize I would have to go and approve it for those particular permissions. That's just something to bear in mind for the future. But that is it. It's not actually super complicated, but it's really powerful what we can now do. I can scrap having to use those deployment scripts just so I can go and create and perform some actions against Entra. At time of recording, it is in preview. So I would keep an eye on the documentation. I would expect these types of objects it can work on to change over time. But for now, you can start playing around with it. It is preview at time of recording. So you may want to be careful of how you use that in production, but certainly you can start evaluating it, start to work out, hey, how I could start leveraging that. But go and check it out. It's really cool. And there's now no limit to what I can do with my lovely, lovely Bicep files. Until next video, take care.